let's do a quick answer to an issue regarding trustworthiness of the Gospels, and it's called Interlocking Gospels. So let me start by telling you this. There's a man named J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case detective, written two really, really good books that you ought to take a look at sometime. One's called God's Crime Scene, and the other is Cold Case Christianity. They're both really, really good. So anyway, he was a cold case detective. He said when he was investigating a crime, he would make sure he talked to the eyewitnesses separately, because if they got together, they might form the exact same story. And he wanted to know realistically how did they see this event. He said he noticed that they had slightly different variations within the basic concepts of that story. And he said when he first came across the Gospels as a non-Christian, he read them and he said, wow. He said, this sounds like eyewitness reporting. And what he means by that is it doesn't sound like it was cooked up by a group that put out this story of Jesus. He says it sounds like individuals who saw things in their own particular way. So I'll give you an example, then I'll explain what I mean, what I think this implies about Christianity. Let's take the story of Jesus before Pilate. He goes to and is interviewed by Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you king of the Jews?" Now, if Jesus says yes, Pilate's going to do whatever he can to get rid of him, because that's a threat to the Roman Empire. This is a potential king. This is a potential problem for the Romans. Well, in one of the Gospels, Jesus simply says yes. And then Pilate turns to the people and he says, "I see no reason to put this man to death." What? That isn't the way Pilate should be reacting. He's supposed to protect the Roman Empire. Why doesn't he get worked up over the fact that Jesus says, "Yeah, I'm a king"? Well, if you go to one of the other Gospels, it's the same account, but this time we learn something that wasn't in the other Gospel. Pilate says, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Yes, but my kingdom is not of this world." So Pilate says, "Well, what do I care then? You're a spiritual kingdom. That's no worry to me. It's no worry to the leaders in Rome, so fine, I'm going to let this guy go." So do you hear that there were two gospel accounts of the same event, and they needed each other to complete the entire scene? Let me give you one other example. So Jesus is on trial, and in one of the Gospels we hear that they mock him and they hit him and they say, "You're the Son of God, you know all these great things, you're a mighty wonder worker. Who struck you?" And you think, well, that'd be easy. If somebody walks up to you and punches you, you go, "Hey, that's the person that did it." But if you read one of the other Gospel accounts of the same event, what do you learn? They blindfolded Jesus, and then they struck him. And so it was like, yeah, you can't even tell who hit you. What kind of king are you? What kind of Son of God are you? But you needed both those Gospels. Let me pick one more. This is the feeding of the 5,000, very famous event. So in one of the Gospels, Jesus turns to Philip and says, "Do you know where we can get some food?" Now you read that and you go, well, Philip's not a very well-known disciple. Why would you, if you're making these stories up, you'd make it about John and Jesus, or Peter and Jesus, or Matthew and Jesus, but Philip? But Jesus turns to Philip and says, "Where can we get some food?" You turn to another Gospel and you find out that Philip is from Bethsaida. Okay, so then you go back to the first Gospel and you find out earlier in the Gospel it says that this feeding of the 5,000 occurred near, guess what, Bethsaida. So why does Jesus turn to Philip? He says, "Hey, you're from around here. Where can we get some food?" But it took you three places to look in two different Gospels to find the whole story. So what's the point of these interlocking Gospels? Well, again, to quote J. Warner Wallace, this represents good eyewitness testimony, because each one is telling the event from his own perspective. These are not copied from each other. If they were copied, in other words, let's say Matthew was the original, and Mark and Luke and John just simply sat down with the Gospel of Matthew and took his manuscripts and copied it over. That's not the case, because they're different from each other, and some present things that are not in the other Gospel. And here's another thing to think about. Forgeries don't do this. If these Gospels are simply forgeries, they were gathered by the church, put together by the church hundreds of years later, they're not going to have these loose ends, like smacking Jesus and saying, "Who hit you?" And you'd say, "Well, pretty obvious. You could see the person that hit you, and you don't learn about that unless you read another gospel. You don't find those messy ends. Forgery is going to try to make sure everything is neat and precise. So for these reasons, I think this is another really good clue that the Gospels are trustworthy.